Hey, I'm James. Welcome to Game Stories, where we write games that tell stories. And in this episode, we are talking about environmental storytelling, which is a term that I'm pretty sure originates in this article by game scholar Henry Jenkins. It's called Game Design as Narrative Architecture. And in it, he argues that games tell their stories largely through the way they construct their playable spaces and the way they use those spaces in different ways to tell stories. A good portion of the article at the beginning is just sort of situating his work within this debate between the ludologists and the narratologists. Maybe you remember this from an earlier episode where they're arguing about are games about game mechanics or games about stories? Can those things be wedded together or not? So he does some work to kind of situate what he's saying within that. But the part that I'm interested in, here I pulled some notes from him, comes later in the essay where he starts saying, well, here's what environmental storytelling is. In fact, let me make this bigger. Where's my font size? Boop. All right. So environmental storytelling, he says, creates the preconditions for an immersive narrative experience in at least one of four ways. So he's saying environmental storytelling is a thing, and it can be a thing in four different ways. Three of these we're not really going to care about in this episode. One's going to be the most important. So let me get these other three out of the way real quick. He says they can be spatial stories, can evoke pre-existing narrative associations. That would be like if you've read all the Harry Potter books and watched all the movies and read all the fan fiction and consumed all things Harry Potter that you can. A game that's set in Hogwarts can be a kind of evocative location for you. You can play that game and feel like you're in Hogwarts, and it tells a story, or resonates with stories that you know in ways that are narrative, right? So that's one way. It can give you a space to be in that's already has stories with it. They can also provide a staging ground where narrative events are enacted. That means they kind of give you a space, and they populate that space with stuff. And then they put you in that space as a player and say, go explore. And the story that comes out is the story of your exploration of that space. It might not be plotted or scripted or anything, but as you wander around this space and discover things, that's kind of a story, right? The third one is the one that we care about in this video, but we'll come back to it. The last one is they can provide resources for emergent narratives. And this is sort of like, if you've ever played The Sims, this is the example that he uses here. If you haven't played The Sims, you should Google it and see what that's about. But basically, it's sort of a sandbox game where you have AI characters that have their own wants and needs, and your job is to sort of be the little demigod of their world and give them the things that they want and tell them when to go to the bathroom. And their AIs interact with each other in ways that produce stories in sometimes funny ways, right? So that's what an emergent narrative would be. It sort of comes out of the game systems itself. So games can tell stories in all those ways. The type of game storytelling, the kind of environmental storytelling that we care about in this video, is this one though. They may embed narrative information within their mise-en-scene. I don't know how to say that word. Mise-en-scène. In other words, they put story information into the world. This is kind of like what a set designer does for movies. They pick the posters and stuff that go in some character's room, or they pick the furniture and they pick what's going to be in the scene. Game designers have a similar thing where they can design the sets and the worlds. They can design the physical space that you're going to be in, and the objects in that physical space can communicate narrative information. How does it do that? Down here. He says this. He says, narrative comprehension is an active process by which viewers assemble and make hypotheses about likely narrative developments on the basis of information drawn from textual cues and clues. So this is something that's true about like any kind of understanding a story. The story gives you clues, like a mystery story gives you clues as you read it, but any kind of story will give you clues as you read it about what it's about and what might happen next. And as you're reading, you sort of are making these guesses about what is the story going to be about, what might happen to the characters, what are the likely outcomes here. So that's happening all the time with any story. For example, in movies, as they move through the film, spectators test and reformulate their mental maps of the narrative action in the story space. So as you're watching the movie, you're seeing what's happening, you're making connections between the different images to put a story together in your head, and you're also trying to anticipate what you might see next. What's going to happen to Bruce Willis when he jumps that motorcycle into the helicopter, right? What are the likely outcomes here? In games, though, he says, in games, players are forced to act upon those mental maps, to literally test them against the game world itself. So as you're playing a game and you're reading the space, and whether that's the 3D space of a 3D video game or the 2D space of a video game or the sort of narrative theater of the mind space that you get in a role-playing game, you're taking in details about the world and making guesses about what they mean, and then you have to go do something based on those guesses. So you're testing out your theory based on what you see. So if you see like a streak of blood across the floor that goes behind a door, and you know you're in a game that has monsters in it that are killing people, you might rightly assume that, hey, maybe there's a monster behind that door. And either A, I should go open the door carefully and then shoot it to get points, or I should probably not even go in that room, right? Okay, he says one more thing about this that I quoted. One can imagine the game designer as developing two kinds of narratives. One relatively unstructured and controlled by the player as they explore the game space and unlock its secrets. The other pre-structured but embedded within the mise-en-scene, awaiting discovery. The game world becomes a kind of information space, a memory place. We'll look at a couple really good examples of this in a minute, but I think this is an important quote to point out because he's saying there's sort of two levels to the story. There's the story of you walking around in the game and looking at stuff and killing things maybe, or collecting things, whatever it is you're doing. And then there's the other level of the story, which is what happened before you got there and what mark has that history left on the world that you're exploring, right? When you're looking at the walls and the floors and the environment and the forest or whatever, when you're seeing the marks left by history, you should be able to read those marks as telling you something about what came before and what might happen next, right? So two levels of story there that we're working with. All right, I think that's enough of Henry Jenkins. I want to bring us quickly to some other folks that are talking about this. This is some slides from a GDC talk by Matthias Warch and Harvey Smith. That's all about environmental storytelling and the whole thing. But Jenkins' article is worth reading in its entirety, and so is this. These slides and their notes are worth reading in their entirety. But I'm going to, again, pull just a few choice things from it. The talk is called What Happened Here, and they begin with this image of two goldfish dead and stuck to a window screen. And they ask the audience, what happened here? And they sort of talk a bit about environmental storytelling and how game environments can sort of structure meaningful experiences for players. And they come back to these slides and ask you again, what do you think happened here? What kind of story is this telling? So if you have a guess, go ahead and make it. I couldn't figure it out. But then I start giving you other images to start filling out this world. Pull back a bit, show you the window a little bit bigger, which doesn't tell you too much more. Then they show you the rest of the room, and they mark in some things for you here. You can see the mold and water damage. You can kind of see a level at which there was mold and water damage, and a level above that which there was not. They say, hey, look, a couch is on top of a coffee table. What do you think happened in this house? And they pull back a little further and give you the neighborhood. This is what the neighborhood looks like. And they pull back further still and give you an aerial shot of the neighborhood. So what happened here? You should probably be able to figure this out by now. You may not know exactly, but you get the gist. These are all images, they say, from Robert Polidori's After the Flood, which is a series of photographs that he took in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So this is New Orleans. The story that happened here is the one of a hurricane. Levees broke that were protecting the city from floodwaters. When those broke, the city flooded horribly. Lots of people were displaced. Lots of homes were destroyed. And these images tell part of that story, right? As the photographer, like a playable character, is wandering through this world and noticing these details, he's noticing small stories about the aftermath of this flood. And they can reconstruct the goldfish story. I don't know if you're going to be able to read this. When the PDF blows up, it's pretty blurry. But so here's like the series of events that they reconstruct from those goldfish, right? They say Hurricane Katrina arrived. The homeowner fled, leaving the pets behind, at least leaving the goldfish behind. The floodwaters hit the home. Well, in between here is the levees broke and then the city flooded. Then the floodwaters hit this particular house. The goldfish were swept from their bowl, meaning the floodwaters rose above the goldfish's bowl, and then the fish were out loose in the water that was engulfing the house. The current of the floodwaters pushed the fish against the window screen. They were held there. When the waters finally receded, they were still stuck against the window screen and they died there, right? That's the whole story of these poor fish. And we can get that whole story, or most of it, just by seeing them there and seeing the environment that was around them, right? If we have some idea that a flood happened or some natural disaster happened, then we can kind of put two and two together and say how that worked out, right? So that's their main. That's sort of their main contribution here. But they have a couple. Oh yeah, here. So they have a couple practical techniques that they offer. I'm not going to cover all of these right now. I'm just going to point out two of them that I think are pretty important. This is sort of their how-to section in this thing. So if you want to focus on what to read in this slide presentation, you could skim all the way down to here and look at how are they placing this together. Here's the how-to. Number 1, establish a discernible chain of events. So have some kind of history in mind about what happened in your world before the player gets there. Think about what either just happened or happened recently or happened over millennia, right? And then think about what kind of physical marks that history would have left on the space so that you can give players concrete details that point to that history. Whether that's a blood streak on a floor leading behind a bathroom door that maybe you want to go back there, maybe not, or whether it's fish stuck to a window screen or anything else, right? The aftermath of a party. You can tell that people were drinking and smoking and the place is kind of screwed up. If you walk into a house like that, you pretty much can have a pretty good idea of what happened there the night before, right? So think about the history of the world, the kinds of things that happened there, and then what sort of condition the world would be in, not just the whole world, but the physical space that the player is in, how that would affect that space, right? This is a really important piece to understand because you can do all the world building you want. You can have this really rich, detailed history and a huge scope and lots of depth, but none of that is ever going to show up for the player unless you figure out some way to embed it in the world. It's no good really to have a character or a non-player character pop up and say, "Hi, let me tell you the entire history of our universe." We don't want that. We don't want to have to listen through that or scroll through all that text. What we want is to be able to look at the physical space around us, see the different details in it, and then piece together in our heads what happened here before. And from that information, hopefully, either gain some actionable information in the game world, or else have some kind of feeling about the overall theme of the game. And that's the other piece that I wanted to point out here that they say. They say, echo the world at large. I don't think I can highlight that, no. Echo the world at large sort of means if your game has a theme, and it should if it's trying to tell a story, if it wants to be meaningful, you should have some kind of idea about what the meaning is, then the details you put in the world should kind of echo that theme. So if your story is about loss and destruction, then, a great detail to put in would be these fish in a screen, right? If you're playing a game in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and it's about loss and destruction, then little details like this do a great job of echoing that theme, right? And making it sort of really personal and really specific for one particular house and one particular family and two particular goldfish, right? That's the kind of detail you want, where you have this general feeling of your world and the details are reflecting that feeling. And they say that there's sort of a reciprocal relationship there, where if you have a theme and you have a mood or a feeling you're trying to establish, then players will be kind of looking for those details in light of that mood. But then those details will also help create the mood, right? So think about the history. How does it show up in the physical space? Think about your theme and the kinds of details that will reflect that. That's the two pieces of their advice that I would point out for right now. But I would encourage you to go and read their whole slideshow. It's great. Okay, so some examples of this. We're going to revisit Gone Home, which if you remember from I think the first episode, I talked about as this game where you just walk around a house and look at stuff. I'm going to show you some screenshots from that, and we'll kind of spoil, I guess, 1/5 of that game by looking at some of the details that tell the story of the mom character, Janice Greenbrier. So we'll look at those and we'll piece together her story, her backstory, and then we'll take a look at a role-playing game adventure module called Deep Carbon Observatory, which does some pretty fantastic work in terms of environmental storytelling. Okay, so let's take a look. These are not all of the screenshots related to the mother story, but it's enough of them that I think you should get the gist. Okay. So early on in the game, sort of in the first room in a closet, we learned that Janice Greenbrier works for the Forestry Service. She's a park ranger. And we see that by seeing her jacket and her name tag here. And in the family portrait that we also find in the same room, we can make the association that Janice Greenbrier is the mother of the main character. Further down a hallway, we find Jan's day planner, weekly planner from last year, and we can open it to a page where we see something happened, meaning she rescheduled some plans. And those plans for the week were couples bowling, cooking class, and ballroom dancing, kind of across the board. But by Friday of the first week, ballroom dancing was out, and then couples bowling and ballroom dancing was out for the rest of the week. We don't know what precipitated that, but it seems like the kind of things that she was doing with her husband, and they got canceled for some reason. Further along in her bedroom, we find a letter from her college roommate, Carol, who's been established in previous documents. And she says, "Dear Jan, oh honey, let me tell you, I understand how you feel. Bob and I have had our down periods too." She's responding obviously to something that Janice has said about problems in the marriage, trouble at home, and Carol's being consoling about that, Carol, her friend. Then the next paragraph she says, "In the meantime, though, this controlled burn, that sounds like quite an adventure. In other documents, it's been established that the Forest Service is going to have a controlled burn, and Jan is going to be in charge of it. She's going to be the person who makes sure they don't burn the whole forest down. In the meantime, though, this controlled burn, that sounds like quite an adventure, but let's cut to the chase. This new ranger they sent, that's what I want to hear about. Ranger Rick, you have to be kidding me. It's perfect. You have to tell me everything." So apparently Jan has written some letter to Carol that says, A, things are not going great right now between me and the hubby, and B, I'm doing this controlled burn thing, and they're sending this new ranger, Ranger Rick, to come help us with it. And she said something about Ranger Rick that's got Carol kind of excited here. Maybe he's really handsome, or maybe, who knows. Right under the bed is a copy of, on Jan's side of the bed, is a copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And the bookmark on the back is written, "Take your time, I'm glad to have it in good hands, Rick." So Ranger Rick is not just helping with the controlled burn, and possibly handsome or something. He's also lending books of poetry to Jan, which she hides under her side of the bed. In the bathroom, we find this book, After the Honeymoon, Rediscovering Your Spouse, Personally, Spiritually, and Sexually, which is some kind of manual about how to get your marriage kick-started again after some kind of rocky time. This could be the husband's, but it doesn't seem to be. The husband details seem to be, or dad details seem to be rooted in his writing career and possible alcoholism. Mom's details seem to be rooted in worrying about this relationship, and maybe, right, so far, maybe developing some kind of new relationship with Ranger Rick. So this is probably mom's, trying to figure out, what do I do with this marriage that's not quite working? Later on in the game, we find this performance evaluation for Ranger Richard Pattermatch. And from his supervisor, Jan, she really liked his performance. And she says great things about him. And then also in this last paragraph suggests that he should stay. He's been so helpful to the ranger station that he shouldn't be transferred back. He should be a permanent feature of this Forest Service area. So keep Ranger Rick around, right? Now, if we just found this document, we would think, oh, well, he's a great worker and she wants to keep him around. Given the other documents, given the other things that the story that we're starting to build up, it seems like maybe something more is going on between Jan and Ranger Rick, right? There's that kind of excited letter from Carol. There's the intimate poetry hidden under the bed. There's signs of trouble in the marriage. So maybe there's more, right? Around the same time in the game, we find an offer of promotion for Jan. The controlled burn went so well that the Forest Service is saying, hey, we're going to promote you and move you to a different place, which would mean a better job, shorter commute, more responsibility, but would also mean she would be distant from the new Ranger Rick. So is she going to take that promotion or not? Then we find a receipt from Salon Josephine where Jan went and got herself looking good. She got a shampoo and a set and a color and a perm and a manicure. Spent $120 on looking nice on February 22nd. Why does she want to look nice? Well, in the same room, kind of hidden in an air vent, we find a ticket stub for Earth, Wind, and Fire on the 23rd. So apparently Jan went to go see Earth, Wind, and Fire. We think it's Jan that went to go see Earth, Wind, and Fire. She wanted to look good that night. Why, though? Was there any special reason? Well, yes, maybe. In a closet just down the hall, we find this letter from Ranger Rick. He says, hi, Jan. I got 2 tickets for Earth, Wind, and Fire on Thursday, but my girlfriend says she doesn't want to go. Her taste in music rears its ugly head again. Again is the key word there, which sort of establishes that Jan and Rick have sort of bonded over their taste in music, and he's sort of been saying, my girlfriend doesn't appreciate good music, blah, 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 but you have good taste in music. Why don't you come to Earth, Wind, and Fire with me? Then he says, well, it leaves me with an extra ticket. Thought you might be interested. More fun than clearing brush in the freezing rain, right, Rick? So Jan gets this letter. She gets herself done up, goes out to a concert with Ranger Rick. Maybe, so the evidence is starting to stack up that maybe something romantic is going on here, something intimate, right? Further on in the game, in the kitchen, we find this on the refrigerator. It's an invitation to Ranger Rick's wedding. Even though Helen Margaret, his girlfriend, had bad taste in music, he's still going to marry her. And Jan and family are invited. Then we find this, which is Jan accepting the promotion, meaning that she'll be moved away from Ranger Rick to this other ranger station or this other supervisory position. And she'll be separated from him. And then the last kind of detail that I'll show here is that there's a calendar where she's marked off, not going to go to Ranger Rick's wedding, can't make it, send regrets, and there's an anniversary trip scheduled for a 5-day anniversary trip, meaning she and her husband are going to go celebrate their anniversary, spend 5 days together, maybe get something rekindled there, right? Okay, so a bunch of details, a bunch of scraps of paper, really, spread all over this house, and from them, we can piece together the history of Janice Greenbrier, or some part of her history. We can see suggestions that her married life wasn't going very well. We can see suggestions that maybe she developed some kind of emotional or physical intimacy with the ranger that was transferred to her station. And then that, sort of toward the end of the story, that maybe she cut things off with him and tried to rekindle things with her husband. That's what it seems like. Maybe the story's a little bit different. There's probably different versions of that story that we can piece together from these pieces of evidence. But the general gist of things, that there's trouble and that there's this Ranger Rick with some kind of situation, I think pretty much anybody can piece together. assuming they're paying attention and finding all this stuff. So this is a really good example of environmental storytelling of the third sense of Henry Jenkins' senses, right? You put things in the world, you have a story in mind, you have a history in mind, and then you insert details in the world that give your players the opportunity to reconstruct that history, okay? And if you play Gone Home, and I think you should, if you haven't yet, you'll see how you'll see more details of this story, and you'll see how similar details flesh out the lives of the father and the sister and you, the main character, and also the previous owner of the house. So one good example of environmental storytelling, Gone Home. Next example I want to point to is Deep Carbon Observatory, which is, where'd it go? Jenkins knows, boom. Which is a old school Renaissance RPG adventure module. That means that there's sort of some contemporary role-playing game designers who wanted to make stuff for kind of an old school kind of role-playing game, like original Dungeons & Dragons or early versions of Dungeons & Dragons. They wanted to kind of recapture some of that feel, but give it a different kind of modern twist or a more artsy kind of twist sometimes. And they're writing new stuff for those systems. So Deep Carbon Observatory is one of those. And it's set in a world where there is a dam, and the dam is broken, and everything downstream from the dam has been flooded, and everything upstream from the dam, the reservoir that was there, is now dry. So 3 basic landscapes, really 4, because there's the Deep Carbon Observatory is something that was buried under the reservoir, sort of this deep cave system where weird stuff is happening. So 4 different major areas that are radically changed by an event. The dam breaks, and everything downstream changes. The dam changes, everything upstream changes in the reservoir zone, and then the Deep Carbon Observatory is revealed and is now explorable. But at the beginning of the game, you don't know that. And in fact, even as you start to read this document as a game master, you don't know there's been a flood. The way this gets introduced is in details. Suddenly, players are just confronted not with the fact that there was a flood or a broken dam, but by a bunch of vignettes of the human cost of that flood and the pressing problems that people are having in the immediate aftermath of this flood. So the way this works is there's sort of a row here of details, little vignettes that players can engage with. And if they don't engage with them, there'll be certain consequences in the story of those. So they'll have a certain amount of time to engage with one or more of these, and then they'll see the next set, and then the next set will happen, and the next set will happen. It's sort of like this flood. It's sort of like a stream of these images that give you this details of what's happening because of this flood. So let's look at the first set. It says, an old man drags a drowned body. Curtis Gill, naked and starved, curses death as he takes his wife's corpse out into the wilderness, saying he's going home. He will die soon. So you can intervene here. You can say, hey, what's up, man? And if you do, there's story that will come out of that. He'll say his wife was a psychic and she said some strangers would bury her, and you can kind of go on this adventure to do that. But if you don't, then he'll just wander off into the woods and die. Here it says, a petty cleric clutching a floating log shouts all as the survivor of his village. He has the key to the church. He will drown soon. So if you intervene here, you can maybe save this guy's life, save him from drowning, and he'll give you the key to his church, which means you'll be able to intervene in a situation later on. And if you don't, you won't have the key, you won't be able to hear that part of the story, and this guy will drown. And then all of this simultaneously, right? You see the old guy, you see the cleric, and then you see a man struggles with a makeshift raft full of children and the old, focused only on his task, ignoring all else. Callow will lose control of the craft and it will slip away. So you can approach this man and help get the kids to shore. And if you don't, then he'll lose control and the kids will float off into who knows where, right? So you have to sort of make this choice right away because this is, the next set of things is going to come out really quickly. And suddenly the adventure is like problem. All these situations and dire emergencies basically for survivors of this flood or people trying to survive this flood. Okay, so that's how the game introduces itself to you, with a lot of really quick environmental details that establish the feeling of a flood has just happened and everything is destroyed, right? The next kind of section is the drowned lands, meaning the whole place downstream from the dam that's been flooded. And you can see there's a map with all these numbered points, which the adventure will then describe what's there and what you might encounter. Here's Carrollmore. That's the town that you first encounter this flood damage in, right? And some people have been washed way downriver by the flood and have ended up here, like that priest or the cleric. We're not going to look at all these points and all these details, just a couple of them that I think do a pretty good job of telling the deep back history of this area. So one is the Sarcophagus, and I'm not going to be able to say this name, so we're just going to call them Amba. The Sarcophagus of Amba. A pair of starving children bob along on what looks like a floating chunk of gray wood. If inspected at close range, the log turns out to be stone. PCs can scrape away the leaves and mud to see an ancient face staring back. Inside is a gold, nobly shaped. In his left hand is a branching key with teeth arrayed like silver leaves. In his right hand he holds an iron sword. So, this is Amba, sealer of the way. Touch his treasures and he will rise up to take them back, return them to his tomb. If he fails or is thrown into the river, etc., etc. And it gives you stats for fighting him, and then tells you like what his sword is all about in case you win and you get to take his sword. So this is some kind of old king that's been mummified and placed in the sarcophagus, and apparently it has washed downstream in this immense flood. He's holding this weird key, which will come into the story later if you happen to get it. What else? What's the next piece of this guy? Not there. Ah, yes. The golden boat. So it's 15 points upstream. Barely visible and jammed deeply in the silt is a gleam of gold. Further discovery requires close investigation over time. This is the ritual heaven ship of King Gamba, same guy from downstream. It is made of gold and shaped like rushes and reeds, incredibly heavy and deeply sunk into the black silt. It's almost impossible to retrieve. And then it tells you you're going to get a bunch of money if you can get it out, blah, 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 blah. So there was a golden boat. There was a sarcophagus inside it. This dam breaks, floodwaters hit, and they get shot out of the dam or from somewhere and end up downstream in different places. Also, around this golden boat, we find the life-saving library of King Amba. The family of Oswald Bone Norman, 4 children and 2 parents, have been starving here for days on this black and sodden copse. Trapped on this isolated outcrop, they hide from the wandering golems, which are like these robotic monsters, magic robots that are bad news. Luckily, they have not yet frozen in the rain and dark. They have found dry paper wrapped in watertight tubes, so it is easily burns. One by one, the scrolls are uncorked and set into the blaze. This has kept the family alive so far, and then it turns out that they're actually magic scrolls from King Amba that they are burning without really knowing what they are. So, which is an interesting situation, because you can intervene and take the scrolls and learn some kind of magic spells, but then you're depriving this family of the heat that they need to stay alive. So, what do, right? But these are the little moments where we can see that King Amba has washed downstream. Some pieces of his legacy, which were somewhere else, are now all over the valley floor because of the floodwaters, right? So where did they come from? Well, they came from the dam. We get a handy map of this dam. And then, in one of the first scenes in the dam, we get to find out where King Amba's stuff came from. Room 1. The room is scoured by flood. Empty stone shelves all around. A large cavity on the floor where something heavy used to rest. And that heavy thing probably was that golden boat with the sarcophagus in it. Painted walls, the action of a crowned figure with the branching key and iron sword. So, there he is. The king chops off the heads of a pale, starved people who crawl toward him offering gold. The king burns alive a beautiful race with dark skin and white hair that could be male or female, hard to tell. The king in sunlight releasing waters, drowning those who toil in darkness. So there's this mural of this King Amba guy, and it doesn't sound like he was too nice, right? He sort of ruled from this dam and controlled the waters of the valley below, and then was sort of ruthless in his reign, right? So that's some backstory about him. And then the next room, room 2, is a similar room, but it also has paintings of a different king, and then it has a boat and the sarcophagus in it. So this room didn't get as washed out as the other one. It seems like the dam broke and pushed water right through King Amba's place and threw his stuff downriver, right? Okay, did we learn anything else about him? Oh, we do. What does the key do, right? The key does this in room 10. At the end of the stairs on the right is another door of black iron. It is locked and there is no key. It's not what the branching key does, but you have to find a way to pick this lock. Inside the room are 20 iron jars, each a meter high. The jars are locked shut, wrapped in chains of iron. The chains lead to a pillar with a central lock in the middle of the room. The lock is unbelievably strange. It looks like modern art. Jars, chain, pillar, and locks are all immune to magical influence of any kind. The lock cannot be picked. Only the branching key of King Amba can open the central lock. There is scratching. This is key. There is scratching from inside the jars. Opening one opens them all. So if you fought off this mummy and kind of figured out this was a bad dude and he was a king, and you have this weird key, and then you go in this room and it looks like that's the weirdest lock I've ever seen. This is the weirdest key I've ever seen. They probably go together. But there's these jars hanging and something's inside them. And that's the thing in the jars. So if you decide to put the key in and turn it, you get this. These stats, these people, they can see in the dark and they fear light because they've been trapped in these jars so long. These are starved figures, their black skin tied against the bone with wasted flesh. Their long white hair is pasted against their bodies. They will attack and try to make for the deep Carbon Observatory if they can. They speak no language you can understand. They will not tolerate the existence of any other intelligent being. So these poor creatures who've been trapped for so long in these jars will come out and try to attack you, and then they'll race for the deep Carbon Observatory if they're not killed. Okay, so I think that's all the King Amba backstory, and it's another good example of this history, right, that this designer had in mind with the king in this valley and how this dam worked and how he used it to rule evilly over the land and do weird magic stuff with weird keys and weird spells. And all that history is sort of placed in this world. And so is the very recent history, the recent catastrophic history of this dam breaking open and then washing those elements downstream. So you get little pieces of this story as you're wandering up through the floodplain and then climbing up through the dam. You're seeing little bits of this backstory and how it works, right? Pretty clever. And there's lots of other good examples of this kind of storytelling in this thing. Do I want to show you one more example? I think I do. Further up is the Profundal Zone. Well, we don't need to know this, but this is sort of the valley, or the reservoir that has now been drained, and there's a bunch of different things happening now because the landscape has changed, the dynamics have changed, and all kinds of things that were at the bottom of the lake are now revealed that are really interesting. And then there's this pit, which is the path down into the deep Carbon Observatory, which used to be obscured by the floodwaters. Inside the deep Carbon Observatory, in this one room, kind of back against a wall, hidden under dirt of the far wall, are these slave spells. And this is the kind of detail that a lot of games, a lot of adventure modules would never even think to include, because they're kind of about the evil wizard and the evil wizard's minions and, his magic spells and powers. But this game takes a little step out of the box a little bit and says, well, what is it like to live under someone like that? What is it like to be, the slave of an evil wizard or a group of evil wizards? What's that like? And he tells you a little bit. He leaves some evidence of what that might have been like here scrawled on the wall. Hidden under the dirt of the far wall are slave survival spells in a simple tongue, decipherable by any mage. All the spells count as level 1, are not very powerful, and can be cast without being noticed. So what kind of spells have these slaves scrawled on the wall to help each other? What is their sort of magical culture that they have and use to survive under harsh circumstances? These spells here: reduce scars. Not heal scars, not remove scars, not that powerful, they're not that strong. but from punishment and from hard labor, they've been cut and scarred, and here's something to make that a little bit less. Their work and their lives are painful all the time. Here's something to take the edge off. They're overworked for long hours, they sweat and they toil, they're not given enough water to replenish their thirst. Here's something to take the edge off of that. This is a hard and horrible life. It's very sad. You wish you were somewhere else, but there is no escape. If you show your sorrow or regret or anger, you're going to get in even more trouble, right? So when you're overwhelmed with emotion, but showing that emotion would be lethal, possibly, here's a spell to hide your sorrow so you can survive. Being noticed by the masters is always bad. They'll either ask you to do something, or they'll punish you, or they'll hurt you in some way. So you want to sneak around. Here's a way that maybe you can avoid notice by saying this spell. There's a lot of loss in a life like this. A lot of things that are taken from you, people you care about that die or are hurt horribly. You're in a state of grief a lot. Here's something to ease your grief process, right? This says a lot. This is the only thing we get about slave life, except for that once you have this in mind, once you're sort of thinking sympathetically about the people who lived here under the masters, then you start to see all of the traps and all of the gizmos and all of the weird magical ritual stuff from a different light, from a different perspective, right? So a very clever little moment of storytelling. And again, the whole book is full of neat details like that, or the whole adventure is full of details like that, so well worth reading. Okay, that's all the examples. So what's the assignment? What have we learned? What have we done? Environmental storytelling can be 4 things. We only really care about one of them right now, which is putting details in the world that tell a story. How do you do that? You do that by first having a story to tell, a backstory, and then thinking about how that backstory would create physically observable instances in the world, right? How would it carve itself into the physical world? Would it leave papers around? Would it have spells carved onto a wall? Would it be somebody's tomb has been washed downstream by a flood and murals on a wall, right? How will that history have shaped the physical space that the players will play through, okay? Putting those details into the world. And also making sure that those details are reflective of the general themes you kind of want the game to be about. Some examples of that we looked at Gone Home, and we looked at Deep Carbon Observatory, both of which you should read and play and check out. So the assignment here is, if you did the last assignment from the last video, you did some world building. You have some sense of the scope and depth of your world. You have some sense of the history of that world and the politics and the social realities of that world, and how that has evolved over time, right? And you kind of have a place where you want to put the player character. So around that space where the player character starts, you should think about what are the environmental details that will give the player a sense of that whole history you've carved out, a sense of the politics that you've carved out, a sense of the social reality that you want to create. All the world building in the world, all the world building you do won't matter if it can't show up for players in ways that they can start interpreting and experiencing, right? So, if you are duplicating the Star Wars universe and the Empire has just taken over and they're blowing up planets with the Death Star, what do we see in the world based on that? If we start in Tatooine and our uncle's house has just been burned down by stormtroopers, then that rubble, that wreckage is our first inkling about the political situation that's happening, right? So what are those details? And that's kind of the next piece here, is for you to think about, given the world that I want to create, given the kind of backstory and history that I want the players to experience in this world, what are some physical details and clues that I can leave around in the world, right in their immediate play area, to start telling them that story? What are the first details? And so this is really just kind of a brainstorming exercise. I would encourage you to just get out paper and pencil and list as many different kinds of details as you can without censoring yourself. And think through all those different aspects that we did in the last video, the politics and how is gender constructed and what's the history, and go through all those and think about, well, how is that going to show up physically in the environment, right? What kinds of things would we see in the world? What kinds of things could we touch? What sort of objects would there be? How would things be destroyed or changed or affected, right? And how are we going to place those in areas that make sense for the game and that make sense for the player to experience them? So generate a huge list of ideas, pick out some good ones, and then start developing, maybe like Deep Carbon Observatory, a little map, maybe even a very small map, maybe a room, maybe a house or some local area. It doesn't have to be as in-depth as Deep Carbon Observatory. But draw that map out and mark places on the map and then describe them. This is where the hairbrush is, and this is what that means and what properties it has. And this is, a crack in the wall and how that got there. And right, start building out a small playable space that tells that story. Okay, and that's it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.